For 17 days, the dog hadn't eaten. Not really eaten, not the way a working dog eats, with purpose and appetite, and that particular focused energy that comes from an animal that still believes the next day holds something worth moving toward. The staff at the Rideau Valley Veterinary and Service Animal Rehabilitation Center in Kemptville, Ontario had tried everything in the first week: prescription appetite stimulants, rotating food sources, premium kibble, raw protein, hand-prepared chicken and rice. One of the younger technicians had taken to sitting cross-legged on the floor of the kennel for 40 minutes at a stretch, reading aloud from a paperback, hoping the sound of a calm human voice might coax something loose in the animal. Nothing worked. The dog, a 9-year-old Belgian Malinois named Sable, would accept perhaps 3 or 4 bites before turning her head away with a finality that felt less like refusal and more like goodbye. The center's director, Dr. Carolyn Heft, had been working with retired military and police service dogs for 11 years. She had seen animals come through the intake process in rough shape before. Dogs with physical injuries, with noise sensitivity, with the kind of reactive aggression that made routine kennel care genuinely dangerous. But Sable was different, and Heft knew it the moment she reviewed the file. The dog wasn't sick. The dog wasn't broken in any mechanical sense. The dog was grieving, and she was doing it with a thoroughness and a quiet dignity that made it almost impossible to reach her. Sable had served 8 years with the Canadian Armed Forces, attached to a Joint Task Force 2 support element operating out of Petawawa. Her handler had been a master corporal named Vincent Oakes, a man who, by all accounts in the service record, had been extraordinary with animals. Oakes had not died in action. He had died in February, 7 weeks before Sable's retirement was formally processed, from a cardiac event that no one had seen coming. He was 41 years old. He had been planning, according to his sister, to adopt Sable officially once the paperwork cleared. The paperwork cleared 3 weeks after his funeral. The dog had nowhere to go. She arrived at Kemptville on a Tuesday afternoon in early April, transported in a D&D vehicle by 2 handlers who had never worked with her before. She walked into the intake area calmly, assessed the space with the measured efficiency of a dog that had been trained to assess every space she entered, and then simply lay down in the corner of her kennel and didn't get up again in any meaningful way for the better part of 3 days. "She's not shutting down," Heft explained to her staff during the morning brief on day 4. "She's waiting, and until she figures out that what she's waiting for isn't coming, we can't really get to her." Nobody on staff knew what to do with that. It was accurate, and it was kind, and it was completely useless as a clinical intervention. By the end of the second week, the mood in the facility had shifted in the particular way it shifts when professionals who care deeply about their work start to feel quietly helpless. The technicians were still doing everything right, logging feeding attempts, monitoring vitals, maintaining the routine of care. But there was a flatness to the morning updates that Heft recognized from the harder cases. Nobody said anything about outcomes yet. Nobody used the word euthanasia in the hallway, but it was present in the pauses, the way it always is when a situation starts to outpace the tools available to address it. It was one of the kennel assistants, a young woman named Britta Solowski, who had grown up on a cattle operation near Swift Current before moving east for school, who first mentioned the man from the county road. "There's a guy," she said one morning, refilling the water bowls along the east corridor. "He walks past the fence line on his way into town sometimes, early before most people are up. He always stops and looks in. He never waves or anything. Just stands there for a few minutes and watches the yard." Heft had heard versions of this description before. The old man at the fence was practically a trope in rural veterinary work. People were drawn to animals in a way they couldn't always explain, and sometimes they expressed that draw by simply standing nearby and observing. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't particularly useful either. But Britta had more. "He was in here once, maybe 2 months before you came on, before my time, but Teresa mentioned him. He came in asking about one of the retired police dogs, wanted to know if anyone was taking him. Ended up not adopting, but Teresa said he knew the dog's whole service history, every deployment. She said it was like talking to someone who'd read the classified version of the file." Heft thought about that for a moment. "You know his name? Solberg," Britta said. That's what Teresa thought. He pays cash at the hardware store in town, and the lady at the counter remembered because she said he didn't look like a Solberg. Nobody pursued it beyond that conversation. There were 17 other animals in the facility, and a full caseload, and the ordinary grind of a working rehabilitation center in the shoulder season, when the mud is still soft and the heating bills are still high, and the grant applications for the next fiscal year are already overdue. The man came to them. He showed up on a Thursday morning near the end of April, about 20 minutes after the facility opened. He drove a truck that was old enough to have rust along the wheel wells, but maintained well enough that it clearly ran without complaint. He was somewhere north of 70, though it was difficult to say how far north, the kind of man whose age registers less as a number than as a quality, something in the economy of movement, the particular stillness of a person who has learned not to expend anything unnecessarily. He wore work clothes, boots that had seen actual work. He carried nothing with him. He gave his name at the front desk as Aldrich, just Aldrich, no surname offered, and asked if he could speak with whoever was managing the Belgian Malinois that had come in from Petawawa. Heft came out herself. She said afterward that she wasn't sure what she expected, but it wasn't what she got. He didn't introduce himself with any kind of credential or history. He didn't explain how he knew about Sable or what connection, if any, he had to the dog's service record. He simply said, in a voice that was quiet enough to require attention without demanding it, that he had heard there was a dog in difficulty and he would like, if it was possible, to sit with her for a while. Sit with her, Heft repeated. Yes, not interact with her, not work with her. Sit with her. That's right. Heft looked at him for a moment. She was a careful person by training and by temperament, and she had policies around public access to the rehabilitation kennels that existed for good reasons. And she was not in the habit of making exceptions based on nothing more than an old man's quiet certainty that he had something to offer. Can I ask what your background is? She said. He looked at her the way people look when they're deciding not to answer a question directly. Not evasively. The distinction mattered. More like a person reviewing a piece of information to determine how much of it is actually relevant to the situation at hand. I've worked with dogs, he said, and I've worked with people who needed a particular kind of quiet. I think they might need the same thing sometimes. That was all he offered. Heft asked him to wait and went back to her office and stood for approximately 90 seconds looking out the window at the parking lot before deciding that the situation was unusual enough to warrant an unusual response. She called Britta in and told her to stay in the corridor during the visit. She went back out and told Aldrich he had 30 minutes. He nodded. He didn't thank her, which she noted. Most people would have thanked her. Britta walked him back to Sable's kennel and unlatched the outer door. She stayed at the end of the corridor, close enough to intervene if something went wrong, far enough to give the visit whatever privacy it was going to need. Aldrich stood at the kennel gate for a moment without going in. Sable was in her usual position, back corner, low to the ground, head resting on her front paws, facing the wall at a slight angle so that the kennel entrance was in her peripheral vision rather than her direct sightline. She registered his presence without acknowledging it. Dogs like Sable are trained to register everything. He asked Britta if there was something he could sit on. She found a plastic step stool from the supply closet and brought it over. He took it, opened the kennel gate, walked in without hesitating, and set the stool down roughly 3 meters from the dog. He sat. He didn't speak. He didn't make any of the sounds that people instinctively make around animals they're trying to reassure. The soft clicks, the gentle call of a name, the low crooning that people believe is soothing and that dogs often experience as pressure. He simply sat with the posture of someone who was entirely comfortable being where he was, doing nothing. Britta watched from the corridor. She said afterward that the first 10 minutes felt like nothing was happening, which was technically accurate and also completely wrong. Something was happening. It was just happening slowly enough that it required patience to perceive. Sable's ear moved first. Just the left one, rotating backward slightly, then forward, the micro-adjustment of an animal recalibrating to a new auditory input that turned out to be the absence of sound. She was listening to him, not making noise. After another few minutes, her breathing changed, not dramatically. A fraction slower, a fraction deeper, the kind of change you notice only if you're already paying attention. At the 18-minute mark, Sable lifted her head from her paws. She didn't look at him directly. She looked at the floor in front of him, which is a very specific thing for a dog with her training to do. It's an assessment posture. She was reading the ground between them. Aldrich didn't move. At 22 minutes, Sable stood up. She moved toward him in the careful, deliberate way of an animal that has decided to investigate something, but has not yet decided how it feels about what it finds. She stopped about half a meter away and put her nose to the air, not sniffing at him, exactly. More like cross-referencing him against something internal, some catalog that Britta couldn't see and wouldn't have known how to read if she could. Aldrich held very still, not the frozen stillness of someone trying not to spook an animal. The natural stillness of someone who has simply stopped moving because there's nothing he needs to do right now. Sable moved her nose to his hand, resting on his knee, and held it there for a long moment. Then she sat down beside the stool, not in front of him, not at the standard heel position that her training would have made instinctive, beside him, slightly behind his shoulder, in the position a dog takes when it is choosing to guard rather than to be guarded. Britta found that she had stopped breathing at some point in the previous 30 seconds. She started again carefully. When the 30 minutes were up, Heft appeared at the end of the corridor. She had come to tell him time was finished, but she stood at the end of the hall for a moment without speaking. Sable was still seated beside Aldrich's stool. His hand had moved at some point. Neither Britta nor Heft could say exactly when, and was resting lightly on the dog's back, not petting, just resting. Heft walked down the corridor quietly. She stopped outside the kennel and looked at the two of them for a moment. "I need to ask you something," she said. Aldrich looked up. "Would you be able to come back tomorrow?" He considered this with the same economy of expression that seemed to characterize everything he did. "Yes," he said. "Same time is fine." He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning for the following week. He always arrived within a few minutes of the facility opening. He always brought the same quiet with him. Not a performed quiet, not the effortful silence of someone suppressing themselves, but the ambient quiet of a person for whom stillness had long since become the default state, rather than something that needed to be achieved. On the third day, Sable ate. Not a full meal, about 2/3 of her morning ration, but she ate it with something approaching intention. One of the junior technicians, a young man named Corey, who had been at the center for less than a year, actually pumped his fist in the corridor when he saw the bowl, which was not a professional response, but was an honest one, and Heft let it go. Over the days that followed, things shifted in the incremental way that real healing shifts. Not dramatically, not with the clean arc of resolution that people want, but in small recalibrations that accumulated into something recognizable. Sable's posture changed. She began to face the kennel entrance rather than the wall. She started acknowledging the staff with the minimal courtesy of a dog that has decided provisionally that the people around her are probably not a threat. She ate consistently. She moved through the facility yard on her morning exercise rotation without the mechanical joylessness that had marked the first weeks. Heft asked Aldrich about himself on the 5th day. She had been thinking about how to approach it. He had not volunteered anything beyond his first name, and she was aware that whatever she asked needed to be framed as curiosity rather than interrogation. "You clearly have experience with animals like her," she said. They were standing in the corridor after his morning visit, Sable back in her kennel, Britta visible at the far end of the hall, pretending to organize paperwork. "Some," he said. "Military?" A pause. "Not the kind that signals discomfort. The kind that signals a decision being made. In a related capacity," he said. Heft waited. "I spent a long time in environments where the margin for error was very small," he said finally, in the tone of someone offering the shape of a thing rather than the thing itself. "You learn, in those environments, that the most important communication often happens before anything is said. Animals understand this better than people do. They haven't been trained out of it." She thought about asking what capacity, exactly. She thought about asking which environments. She looked at him. The careful stillness, the deliberate economy of everything about him, the way he stood in the corridor of a rural Ontario rehab center at 7:45 in the morning with the particular ease of a man who has stood in considerably more difficult places than this, and decided against it. "She trusts you," Heft said instead. "She recognized something," he said. "That's a bit different. What did she recognize?" He looked toward the kennel where Sable had settled again, watchful and calm. "That I know what it's like to come back when someone doesn't," he said quietly. Heft didn't press further. "Some things close behind themselves like water, and you learn when to let them." By the third week of his visits, The question of Sable's long-term placement had become unavoidable. The center's mandate was rehabilitation and transition, not permanent housing. There was a list of approved adoption candidates, vetted households, former military and law enforcement families primarily, people with the experience and the space and the understanding of a working dog's particular psychological architecture. Heft had already begun the process of reviewing the list when Aldrich arrived one morning and stood for a moment in the entrance in a way that was slightly different from his usual entrance, as though he had made a decision between the parking lot and the door and had not entirely finished making peace with it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I thought you might," Heft said. The formal adoption process for a retired Canadian Armed Forces service animal involves a background check, a home visit, a behavioral assessment of the candidate household, and several weeks of supervised integration. It is thorough, which is appropriate, and it takes time, which is also appropriate. Heft initiated the file on Aldrich. She asked him then for his surname, which he provided, and which she did not share with staff, a decision she made quietly and without explanation, and began working through the steps. The home visit was conducted by a DND contracted assessor named Margaret Finch, who had been doing this work for 8 years and had approved approximately 200 placements in that time. She drove out to the property on a Thursday afternoon in mid-May, a small acreage off a county road east of Kemptville, and filed her report 3 days later. The report was brief by Finch's usual standards, which was unusual. It noted the property was appropriate. Fenced, quiet, adequate space, no other animals present. It noted the candidate demonstrated clear familiarity with working dog handling and behavior. It noted one other thing, which Finch marked with a single asterisk and no further elaboration. The property contained, in a small room off the back hallway, a collection of photographs that she had not been invited to look at but had seen briefly when a door opened in passing. She could not make out the details of the photographs at distance, but they appeared to be documentation of professional work in various environments over a span of several decades, and several appeared to include individuals in military or governmental contexts that she did not recognize, but that suggested to someone with her experience a career history that had not been fully disclosed in the application. She approved the placement. She noted in a private addendum to the file, which she flagged for the DND civilian liaison rather than the center's general file, that she had no concerns about candidate suitability. Quite the opposite, and that she suspected the candidate may have deliberately undersold his qualifications out of a preference not to be processed as a special case. She was right about that. Aldrich had spent the better part of 40 years being processed as a special case in contexts where that designation was not a privilege but a complication, and he was thoroughly done with it. He wanted a dog and a quiet piece of land, and mornings that started before the rest of the county was awake. He had earned all three several times over, in ways that were not recorded in any file that Finch would have had access to. The formal transfer took place on a Tuesday in late May, overcast and cool, the way late May in eastern Ontario sometimes insists on being despite the calendar. Heft brought Sable out through the facility's side entrance to the parking lot where Aldrich was waiting. He had driven the same rusted truck. He was wearing the same work clothes. He stood at the tailgate with the patience of someone who has learned that the important things in life arrive at their own speed and cannot be hurried. Sable came through the door and stopped. She turned her head and assessed the parking lot with professional thoroughness, the perimeter, the exits, the vehicle, the man. Then she crossed the lot without hesitation and sat down beside him, in the same position she had chosen in the kennel 3 weeks before. Slightly behind his shoulder, the guard's position. Heft stood at the side entrance and watched them for a moment. She had overseen a lot of transfers in 11 years. She had learned to read them, the dogs that left with relief, the dogs that left with residual anxiety, the occasional dog that looked back at the facility door as though it had just made a mistake. Sable did not look back. She was already watching the perimeter of the parking lot with the focused, purposeful attention of an animal that has decided that the perimeter of this particular place, wherever it is now her responsibility. Heft signed the transfer documents and passed them through the truck's window. Aldrich signed them and handed them back. He didn't say much. He rarely said much, but as he was folding himself back into the driver's seat, he paused. "She's going to be all right," he said. It was not a hope. It was not a reassurance offered for Heft's benefit. It was a statement of logistical fact, delivered by someone who had assessed the situation and reached a conclusion he was confident in. "I know," Heft said. She watched the truck pull out of the lot and turn east on the county road. She stood in the side entrance for a minute after it disappeared from view, not quite ready to go back inside. In 11 years she had learned not to get attached to outcomes, which was sensible advice and which she had never entirely managed to follow. Britta found her there a few minutes later. "How'd it go?" "Well," Heft said. "It went well. Do you think she'll be okay? With him, I mean." Heft thought about the photographs in the room off the back hallway. She thought about the way Aldrich stood in spaces, not occupying them but managing them, quietly. The way people manage things when managing things has become so fundamental to who they are that it operates below the level of conscious decision. She thought about Sable choosing the guard's position, again and again, the dog's own assessment running in parallel with no prior arrangement between them. "I think," she said, "that she's probably with the one person in Kemptville who needs her exactly as much as she needs him, which is how these things are supposed to work." The county road east of Kemptville is the kind of road that Ontario still has in its quieter corners. 2 lanes, no shoulder worth mentioning, the land opening out on either side into fields that are past the dramatic stage of spring green and settling into the long, workmanlike green of a Canadian summer getting down to business. There are farms along it, and a few properties that are harder to categorize, and one small acreage with a good fence and a yard that is visible from the road in the morning if you happen to be driving past when the light is right. People who drive that road regularly in the early morning hours have begun to notice something over the past few weeks. An old man and a large dog moving together along the tree line at the property's edge in that particular quiet hour before the rest of the county is properly awake. The dog moves close beside him, watchful, scanning the perimeter in smooth, practiced arcs. The man walks with the unhurried ease of someone who is exactly where he chose to be. Nobody knows much about him. He pays cash at the hardware store. He doesn't make conversation for its own sake. He has the kind of face that suggests he has seen more of the world than he intends to discuss, and the kind of stillness that suggests whatever he saw, he came to terms with it on his own and in his own time. The dog, people notice, never leaves his side. There are 2 of them out there on that quiet road in the early morning, each carrying something the other one understands. And it turns out that in the absence of the people and the places and the particular version of the world that they were built for, what they have built instead is this: a perimeter to walk, a morning to share, and the uncomplicated loyalty of 2 old soldiers who found each other at the right time. That is enough. In Aldrich's experience, it is more than enough. It is, in fact, precisely what enough looks like when you've spent a long time living without it.